The bell rang aloud from downstairs, my attention now being torn from the photo and my thought to the ringing from below. I took one last look at the picture before heading downstairs to see where our newest guest could be. Once I rounded the bend and came down the staircase, I became aware of a smell that began wafting from the lobby. It wasn't a terrible smell, it was quite pleasant actually. It had a soft floral scent and undertones of citrus. It was a woman's perfume. As I reached the last step, I could see the woman in question. She was a young woman, not much older than myself, and she had long, dark brown hair with notes of caramel and red plaits and afro puffs on top of her head. When she turned to look at me, she smiled brightly. Her eyes were brown like her hair, only they contained flecks of green and hazel. Her skin was a dark, creamy brown that radiated a sun-kissed warmth. She was as tall as a year-old sapling and every bit as lean and willowy, wearing a leaf green halter top and blue jean bell-bottoms with flowery, yellow and red stitching near the pockets. She was very beautiful. As I made my way behind the counter, I began to say, "Good morning and welcome to the Hotel Bella Muerte. How may we serve you today?" But all I got out was, "Good morning and welcome to," before I noticed something strange. In her bag, which sat on the floor, was something moving. At first glance, all I saw was a swishing black and white striped tail. I did a double take, and that's when I saw that the tail was attached to a full-grown lemur that now popped its head from the bag. She giggled when she saw the look on my face. "Oh, isn't he the cutest? I have had him ever since he was a baby." I had never seen a live lemur before, other than at the zoo my family used to visit when I was a child or in nature documentaries. I looked from the lemur back to the lady and replied, "Yeah, he is. What's his name?" "His name is Wally." "Wally," I echoed. "Wally is a wonderful name for him. May I pet him?" "Of course, he's so sweet and soft," she responded. I bent down to pet the lemur, in awe of having the privilege to touch such a wild and exotic creature. As I reached out my hand slowly, the lemur gave it a quick sniff before it nuzzled into my hand. The lady was right. It was very soft and sweet. "Aw, Wally likes you," she giggled. After petting the lemur, I returned to my clerkly duties. "How may I help you today, Miss?" "Deborah, but you can just call me Deb if you'd like. I'm just traveling through and I saw this gorgeous hotel in town and thought I'd stay and explore for a little and stay the night." "Of course, Miss Deborah. Any room preferences?" "If you have a room with a view of the town, that would be nice." "Of course. Room number 1 has an excellent view." I accepted her payment, walked to the name cards, wrote her name down, and grabbed the room key. "You can follow me." I took her to room number 1. Once I opened the door, the room almost seemed made for her. I had forgotten the theme of the room, the jungle theme. She squealed with delight when she saw the room, and I noticed even Wally perked up by the sight of the various plants and small trees that decorated the room. He would have some place to hide and climb now. "Oh, but what a lovely room. I think Wally and I will be right at home here." "Wonderful. I'm glad you like it. Is there anything more I can do for you?" "No, not at all. I think Wally and I will settle in before leaving to explore the town." "Awesome. Well, let me know if you need anything. I'll be around. Until then, I'll let you two settle in and get comfortable." "Thanks," she responded, and with that I turned and headed back to my room. Once I was there, I was able to look at myself in the full-length mirror next to the wardrobe. I looked rough. I had the same clothes on that I had worn the day before, my short-sleeved red check shirt and skinny jeans, and they were all wrinkled and bunched together in some places. My hair, no longer in ponytail, now hung in more of a half ponytail than anything, and many strands of hair flowed freely about my face. My makeup had rubbed off and my lipstick smeared. My eyes looked tired and bloodshot, and I had raccoon eyes from rubbing my teary eyes the night before. It was anyone's guess how Deborah didn't notice, and if she did, she said nothing, for which I was grateful. Now that I had gotten her settled in, I decided to take a quick shower, redo my makeup, and put on some clean, fresh new clothes. I chose to wear a bright, happy, navy blue sunflower dress that came to my knees, a yellow short-sleeved cardigan to go with it, and my ruby red pumps. And to complete the look, I added a few articles of jewelry, small gold hoop earrings, and a gold, rose-engraved locket that had been passed down in my family for generations. Once I had finished getting dolled up, I made my way to the kitchen to grab a bite to eat before I, too, like Deborah, began to explore the town. I got to the fridge and looked inside once again. Nothing. It was completely empty. I closed it and thought about what I wanted to eat that morning and decided to check the cabinets. The cabinets held exactly what I wanted and nothing more. Just a granola bar and an apple. I found this unusual, like all of the other things at the hotel, but this was one of the more exciting things to be discovered. I took my breakfast items and left the room. As I went down the hallway on my way back downstairs, I decided to check on Mr. Elberton to see if there was anything I could do for him, but when I got to room number 8, his name card was gone, and when I opened the door too, so was he. Not a suitcase or hair left behind. I shut the door and went on downstairs. Once there, I wrote a note explaining where I was and what cell phone number I could be reached at should I be needed and placed it on the front desk. I then exited the building. As I stood on the steps leading from the hotel, the late summer sun shone bright and hot in the sky. The warmth was penetrating my body and touching my soul. I had needed this. The fresh air and light of day to wash away all my troubles of the night before. I stepped into the street and began to explore the town. There were only a few buildings left standing of what I'm sure was the original town, many of them damaged by the weather and time. Some had been burned and charred in places. The signs on the buildings had faded and were hardly legible, but some I could still read. There were 5 buildings in total, including the hotel. The one I stood before now was the post office. The post office was a simple building, made from the same maple wood that grew here in the woodlands of the East Mountain regions of the nearby area. It sat directly next to the hotel in the line of buildings with only an alleyway between them. It looked small and squatty compared to the hotel, only about 1/3 of the size and 1/4 of the depth. The sign was inlaid in the wooden front of the buildings at the highest point just below the sheet metal roof. Out of curiosity, I decided to go inside and check the place out. As I walked into the building, I heard the ringing of a small bed just above my head, signaling my entrance into the building. Walking in, I wasn't greeted with the normal post office look I'd come to know. Instead, it looked rather bare. There were no modern necessities other than the light bulbs that hung overhead, just a small wood-burning stove with a percolator sitting on the only range, a rocking chair that sat next to the back left-hand corner of the room near the stove, as well as a few other chairs that sat around a table in the center of the room. I noticed quickly that there was also a wrought iron bed in the other backhand corner of the room with an old quilt for a blanket. Other than that, there was nothing very spectacular or worth mentioning. Standing in the corner of the room, just beginning to pour himself a cup of coffee from the percolator, was a man of normal height and muscular build. Without even turning around, he asked in a gruff, gravelly voice, "Would you like a cup of coffee, miss? I've got an extra one." He turned after he said this to me to look at me directly. I felt my cheeks grow hot and hurried to look away from the man. He was handsome and looked only a little older than I did. His hair was a sandy blonde and his eyes were candy apple green, vibrant in color. He had a natural tan and was broad-shouldered, giving him an athletic look. He wore a dusty-looking, white long-john undershirt that had the sleeves rolled up halfway to his forearm, a pair of equally dusty and dirty light brown slacks with suspenders, and an old, beige cowboy hat that looked well-worn and weathered. No, thank you," I stuttered out. As he walked towards me, I could hear the heel of his boots hit the floor. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" I forced myself to look up then, my cheeks still blushing. I hoped to God he hadn't noticed or thought I had simply been out in the hot sun for too long. I work at the hotel next door to you. I've only been here a day and I had some free time, so I decided to check out the town. You were the first stop. He looked me up and down then, giving me the once-over. I felt so embarrassed. Why would my cheeks not stop burning? I decided to cover the one that faced him while I pretended to look at a single hanging mirror on the wall. He came closer still until he was right in front of me. I looked at him then, for the first time longer than a few seconds, and now noticed since he was up close, he also had light freckles on his cheeks and nose. My breath hitched. I didn't even know this man. He was a stranger to me, so why was I being so shy? Never in my life had I experienced this, and I was hoping the feeling would go away quickly. I liked being in control of my own emotions and body. After looking at me for what seemed like a really long time, he spoke again. "So, you're the newest caretaker of the hotel, and what would your name be?" "Autumn Winters," I replied, still lacking confidence. "And who might you be?" "My name is Jasper Moon. I'm the postman here in town, but I'm sure you already gleaned that." I looked at the place once more and asked, "Do you live here in the post office?" He laughed softly in response. "Oh, yes, ma'am, I do. But I wouldn't exactly call this place an office. It's a post and a place to call home. Nothing more." "Oh, but you are in charge of delivering the mail and packages, are you not?" I asked, gaining more confidence by the minute, the redness of my face slowly dwindling. "Of course. That is what I was paid to do, after all." I felt embarrassed for the second time in his presence. My confidence dashed no sooner than I gained it. I had just asked such a stupid question. Of course he worked there. Why would I think otherwise? I must have stood there a little too long searching for a reply to his sarcasm that had taken me off guard, because he began to laugh again as he turned to walk over to the table. He took one of the chairs and slid it out from under the wooden frame of the table and turned the chair around now to face me and sat down. "Well, Miss Autumn Winters, I must say, my first impression is that you're not going to last long here in this town." "What does that mean?" I retorted, growing a little upset. "You're too everything you shouldn't be. Too meek, too timid, too dainty, too young, too small. Not too bright, and clearly not equipped to deal with the sort of things you'll be facing in this town on a daily basis," he replied, and taking the first sip of his coffee. I felt my face growing hot once again, this time not in shy embarrassment but rather in anger. Who was he to judge me? How could he tell I wouldn't last long when he had literally only just met me? What sort of energy was I giving off that read stupid failure to him? Yeah, I was small, but what did that have to do with anything? Yeah, I was young, but I was still a fully fledged adult who legally could do just about anything under the law. Yeah, as I had well figured out, I was inexperienced in dealing with the norms of daily hotel life. I learned that in my first 24 hours. And I wasn't normally shy. I just got flustered over how handsome he was and stumbled over my words a little and asked one obvious question, not wanting to just assume things. Though the thing that got me most worked up in that moment was that he called me stupid. I was many things, but I was not and never have been stupid. "Now wait just a minute," I said, moving a little closer to where he sat. "Who are you to tell me what I am and what I'm not? You don't even know me." "I don't know you, but I know your type. I've seen caretaker after caretaker pass through this town, and only 3 have lasted longer than a few days or at most a few weeks. Every single one of them, with the exception of the 3, weren't prepared for and never adapted to this life. It's just how things have always been, and how they always will be till this town no longer stands," he replied, draining his cup in a few large gulps. "You don't know that. No one can know that. It's something that time will have to tell," I said as I crossed my arms in my defense. "We'll just have to wait and see then, won't we?" He stood now from his seat, placing his empty cup on the table. "Yeah, I guess we will, and you'll see you're wrong about me," I said sarcastically as I spun on my heels and headed for the door. "Have a good day then, ma'am," he said as I walked out the door, ignoring him and his goodbye. I no longer felt like exploring the town after that encounter. It left me frustrated and huffy. I decided to go back to the hotel and just try and work out my frustration by cleaning the place. When I got back to the hotel, I figured that the first thing that would need cleaning was room number 8. Since Mr. Elberton had stayed the night, though he left the room in good order, it still needed going over. It took me a moment to gather the cleaning supplies in the closet behind the front desk, but once I had everything, I was ready to get started. While walking out from the closet, I accidentally knocked the letter to the ground, and its contents slipped out. When I reached down to pick up the letter, it had opened to the specific rules outlining the cleaning of the various rooms. I took a closer look at it, not remembering having read this part. Why the owners felt the need to write exactly how to clean everything, down to polishing chess pieces, I didn't know, so I continued to read the letter. My eyes scanned the notes and landed on the rule for room number 8. Rule number 67. Make sure to return all items Mr. Elberton takes to the various other rooms in the hotel and buildings in the town. I was a little confused, to say the least. In all the time I had spent with Mr. Elberton the night before, I had never seen him take anything. I suppose, though, he could have taken any number of items in his pockets or his bags while he was left unattended. It seemed like a simple enough task, though, I thought. But things are never simple or easy in the hotel, so I went up to his room with the cleaning supplies and got to work. In the process of cleaning the room, I was shocked by the amount of things Mr. Elberton had taken. There were a number of items, ranging anywhere from as small as a quarter to as large as a baby elephant. Here's a list of the items he had taken. 7 spoons from the dining room, 5 chess pieces from the chess set in the lobby sitting room, 2 dozen boiled eggs from what I could only think would have been the fridge, all of them hidden throughout the room like some sort of poor man's Easter egg hunt, 4 dolls from the doll room. How we got in there is anyone's guess. The door's locked during the day and at night after the dolls have been moved to face the wall. 9 some odd books from the library down the way, at least I think they were the library's books. 12 potted plants from the jungle room where Deborah was now staying, most in the smallest of pots and 1 young tree. 3 bottles of pills, none of which was in his name, but thankfully also not missing any. Yeah, I counted them all. And lastly, 1 stack of letters with a note attached asking for me to mail them. After hunting down all the eggs and throwing them away, I returned the chess pieces to the sitting room, the dolls to the doll room, and placed all the dolls back in their places and all the spoons to the dining room. The last thing I did was drag the little tree to Deborah's room as I balanced all the rest of the potted plants on various parts of my body and knocked on the door with my foot. She opened the door and gasped when she saw all the plants that probably looked like they were sprouting from me. Thankfully, she didn't mind my intrusion and asked no questions or even seemed fazed when I placed the plants in her room. My last order of business was to return all the items taken from around town. After gathering all the items together, I got ready to take them back to the various places in town, but before I left, I needed to put stamps on the stack of letters. I grabbed a booklet of stamps from the front desk drawer. I flipped through letters licking the stamps and placed them on the envelopes as I went along. They were all addressed to people whose names I didn't recognize, but I absent-mindedly read through them anyway. 3/4 of the way through the stack, I dropped the mail on the floor as my eyes grew wide. Oh my God, what had I just done? I began to freak out, wondering what fresh hell I was about to go through because I licked all the damn stamps. I remembered there was something about licking stamps in what I had come to consider my survival manual. I reached behind me and grabbed hold of the letter of rules given to me by the owners and anxiously flipped through the rules. As my eyes scanned the pages, I finally settled on rule number 132. Always lick the stamps in the presence of the postman. What the hell kind of rule was that? Even though I knew the rules were in place for a reason, because so far, not following them led me astray, I didn't want to go back to the same place I had just been and have to talk to the postman. I probably would have knowingly ignored the rule if it hadn't been for the sudden and inexplicable dizziness that had suddenly washed over me. I waited for a few minutes to see if the dizziness would pass, but it didn't. That's when I knew I screwed up for sure. Knowing I was going to have to go back to the post office made me angry at myself. Knowing I had forgotten the rule made it worse. And knowing I was going to have to basically admit to the postman that he had been right about me made it so much worse. I decided after a few more minutes of debating, when the dizziness only got worse, that I would take the plunge and go next door. As I made my way down the front steps, I almost tripped and fell. I felt as if I had had one drink too many, causing me to stumble. Once down the steps, I made the trek next door. The distance was probably only about 200 feet, but it seemed almost as if the ground shifted and stretched, becoming longer than what I had previously remembered. The drunken feeling only got worse the further I stepped, and my muscles began to weaken. I didn't know what was wrong with those stamps, but damn if it wasn't messing me up. I opened the door this time to find the postman sitting at the table. At least, that's what I thought he was doing. I couldn't tell as my mind began to become cloudy and my vision blurred. Nothing seemed to make sense. I stumbled inside straight to the center of the room where the table was. I had to hold on to something as the room spun around me. The postman looked up from where he was sitting reading a book when he saw me. He looked at me, now getting sloppy and droopy, and only shook his head. Now I know I made you upset when you left here earlier today, but I didn't take you for a drunk. Guess you were right. I did have you pegged wrong. I'm not drunk, I stammered. I just licked the stamps. He let out a belly laugh, deep and long. Oh, tell me, did you even read the letter given to you by Miss Mary and Miss Martha? Or did you just want to see me again so soon? He teased. No, I said a little too loudly without meaning to. I just forgot. Well, I don't know what to tell you. You should have had those memorized by now. Those rules are the keys to your survival. If you want to last here, I suppose you better get to it, he said with a non-empathetic look on his face. I slumped in the chair nearest to me and to the side of him. Isn't there something you can do to make it stop? Stop the spinning, I mean. Yes, ma'am, I can, he said, rising from his seat. But it won't work nearly as well since you didn't take it before you licked the stamps. What won't work as well? I asked, laying my now pounding head on the table. The elixir I made to counter the effects of the stamps, he answered over his shoulder, walking toward a set of cabinets in the back of the room. Pulling out a small, blue glass bottle, he walked back and sat down next to me. How many stamps did you lick? I don't know, maybe 6 or 7. There were a lot of letters to post, I said in response to his question. Well, I reckon you better drink that whole bottle then. Why he found this funny, I didn't know. I didn't know a lot of things at the time, but I did as he said. I pulled the cork out of the top of the bottle and smelled the contents. It smelled disgusting, but if it would make the dizziness, splitting headache, weak muscles, and overall terrible feeling I was experiencing go away, I would have drunk a gallon of the stuff. I tipped the bottle back and gulped down the whole thing before I had a chance to truly taste whatever was in the bottle. I'm glad I did because it was all I could do to hold the liquid down. After a few moments, the dizzying effects of the stamps lessened and the headache got better. I still felt weak and worn and thin, though. "What did you put on those stamps?" I asked after I had regained my composure a little. "I didn't put anything on those stamps. I wasn't the one who made them, but to answer your question, the people who did make them made the glue on the stamps from the sticky resin that comes out of some of the mushrooms that used to grow here." "Great, I'm not drunk, I'm stoned," I said as I tried to stand, only to find I couldn't feel my legs as they gave out from underneath of me. "Whoa there," he replied, jumping up and catching me before I fell. "How about you just lie down now and sleep it off? It's the only thing you can do now. And just know you may have some interesting dreams." At this point, my whole body went limp, and I suddenly found I could no longer talk. Whatever type of mushroom the stamps had been made from, or the liquid from the blue bottle, must have had a tranquilizing effect. The postman then carried me over to where the bed lay in the corner of the room. He gently placed me on my back, and turning me on my side, he placed a pillow underneath of me. I had never done drugs in my life up until this point. I hadn't even smoked weed, but I knew from watching certain TV shows and movies, he had placed me on my side to prevent me from choking on my own vomit. I now grew a little afraid. If I had just licked one stamp and drank the liquid from the bottle, I probably would have been fine. But I licked multiple stamps and drank the blue bottle elixir. Was I going to be all right? I didn't even have time to ask the question before I passed out. Once again, in the span of only 24 hours, I dreamt of years long past. My dream started in a crowded town, one where there were more people than it seemed possible for a town that size to hold. There were all kinds of folks. Most of them looked like they came from poor backgrounds, and some looked middle class, and none looked as if they were rich. They walked swiftly through the town, all headed in the same direction. I tried to see where they were headed, but I couldn't. But in this dream, I had the power to walk. I walked shoulder to shoulder with the large group of people through the dirty, dusty streets and past all the many buildings far too close together. The town itself was old. It looked very similar to what I imagined New York might have looked like during its industrial age, when people of all nations and backgrounds flocked to it for the promise of a better life. The Georgian-era buildings stood tall and close together, and many dilapidated and seemingly crudely built, all as old as the town itself, which I guessed to be around the early 17 to 1800s. Many of the buildings seemed to have more than one family living in them. How they supported the weight of the people inside, I couldn't figure out, because some of the buildings looked like they would buckle at any minute. Despite their condition, they were all painted beautifully, almost in an attempt to cover up their run-down nature. When we reached the end of town, I could see where a clearing opened up, and I understood where we were. We were in an old textile mill town. The giant mill houses spanned acres, and there must have been a dozen of them. Each had its own purpose in the production of the various types of fabric they produced, and the people who worked there appeared to be divided into status groups based on where they worked. There was definitely a hierarchy amongst the people. The upper-class people worked in the buildings that got the fabrics ready for shipment. The middle-class people worked in the weaving and making of the fabrics, and the lowest and poorest class of people worked in the gin houses. As I walked with the people, it was as if my feet took a life of their own. I could no longer choose the direction I wanted to go. I went along with it and made my way into the clearing with the higher class of people on their way to the packing and shipment building. The building was the smallest of the 12, with wide open docks and doors, and a loud whistle signifying the changing of the shifts. People entered as others exited the place, and we went through the doors and entered therein. Once inside, I was shocked at the amount of fabrics there were. There were all kinds. There were many different shades of warm wool, exquisite silks, sturdy cotton, and comfortable linen. Some had floral prints and others paisley, all in different colors and patterns. The sheer number of the different fabrics was astonishing. Despite the size of the building, it held so much. As I looked around, I became aware of a person I had known I had seen before. I couldn't place my finger on it at first, but the longer I stood, the more convinced I became. It was the woman from the picture outside my door, the picture of the Bennett family, Rosa Bennett, dressed in a fine navy blue and black silk floor-length dress. She stood on the second floor of the building towards the back where the smarter and more learned workers had their desks. As I watched her, I noticed she stared ahead, hands on the banister looking down to where I was. Then it hit me. She wasn't watching the workers or caught in a daydream. She was looking straight at me. I tried looking behind me to see if she was merely looking through me at something since no one else could see me. But when I turned back around, I saw her smile. Then she walked with one hand still on the banister, guiding her down the stairs. As she descended, she kept her eyes locked on me, never looking elsewhere. I began to become a little intimidated by her stare. It was constant and purposeful, just as her walk was. I knew she had something to say before she even opened her mouth. "Hello. I'm glad we can finally meet face to face. I've heard about you and your arrival and have wanted to meet you, though I didn't realize it would be so soon," she said with a slight giggle. Before I had found the words to reply, she continued, "Do you know where you are?" No, I don't believe I do. I can tell it's a much bigger and older town than where the hotel is, though." "Yes, it is. It's a town back east where I came to when I was young, after I was married to my husband. I wasn't prepared for this life and hated it here. It was too uptight and I didn't like the people whose company my husband kept," she said with disdain. "If you didn't like it, then why did you stay?" "Things were different then. A woman couldn't divorce her husband, even if she had good reason, and I didn't. I hated being married to him. I hated being so far away from my family and friends, but he was always kind and civil to me. And when I had my daughters, it sealed my fate. I certainly couldn't leave them even if I wanted to. I had no means of making a living or going back home, and I couldn't take my daughters away from their father. Even if I had been able to make a living for myself, I couldn't feed 3 hungry mouths," she replied a little mournfully. I knew she was right. It can be hard enough today for a woman to leave her husband, let alone in the early 1800s. I noticed, too, now that she was up close, she wasn't a white woman either. Her copper-tan skin wasn't just from too much sun. She looked much older than I was sure she was. Wrinkles and lines traced the outlines of her face, and gray streaks flowed through her jet-black hair. Her dark brown eyes looked weary from the many years of being shackled to a life she never wanted or felt she needed. As I looked at her, I could sense her pain, sorrow, and regret. She had lived a life not meant for her, and it had broken her spirit. I couldn't tell you how sorry I felt for her in that moment, yet she looked more sorrowful still when she spoke these next words. "You see, I grew up on a ranch in Mexico. My father was well known to be one of the best cattlemen in the region. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable. I loved the life I lived, the wide open spaces, my horses that could run freely where they wished, and my family that was so very close-knit. It was a simple life, but a life well lived." She paused a moment before continuing to speak. "Oh, when I was 15, a man from America came. He was from the East and wanted to establish a business near where I lived. He came to the ranch because he had heard my father spoke English and he needed a translator. I even remember the day he came. I was getting ready for my quinceañera. It was only a few weeks away, and my mother and grandmother were making my dress as I stood on a stool so they could hem it. He saw me and got a strange look on his face. He told my father I was the prettiest girl he had ever seen. I saw him many times after that. He met with my father often. After he had conducted his business, he came back to the ranch and asked my father for my hand in marriage. At first, my father said no, but when he offered him a large sum of money, or as he put it, for his troubles, my father agreed. The ranch hadn't been doing well that year, and in order to keep it running, my father could use the money. So he sold me and traded my life for the sake of my whole family's well-being. We married a few weeks after my 15th birthday. I wasn't the beaming bride everyone expected me to be. My friends tried to calm my spirit by telling me what a wonderful life and opportunities I would have being married to a rich man. But it did nothing for me, and the day after the wedding I had to say goodbye to my friends, family, and home. I never saw them after that, nor did I ever walk again in the land of my birth. My eyes filled with tears hearing her story. I understood her a little more then, and it made more sense what she told me later on. After she had told me her life's tale, she looked from the ground where her eyes had fallen back to me. "Come with me, I need to show you something," she said as she grabbed my hand and led me to the back of the building. When we went through the door, we were no longer in the packing and shipping building. It was as if we had simply walked through a portal to the entryway of someone's home. I noticed quickly, though, that it wasn't a house at all. It was actually a railway car, decorated elegantly. The car held everything a person would need to live in comfort. To the left side, chairs, a couch, and a small table with a vase of dried flowers on it. A small love seat on the opposite side between two end tables. Beautiful stained glass lamps and hanging lights that gave a colored glow to the room. And the carpet on the floor looked new and expensive. It looked almost too beautiful to live in by my own standards. She let go of my hand then, and we stood there as the scene played out before us. I could see her there, sitting on the love seat, even though she also stood next to me, wearing a far less expensive dress, more common and designed for a simpler life. She was sipping tea from fine china, a book on her lap. All looked peaceful and calm in the room. I half-heartedly wanted to join her, but as we stood there, her husband entered, and the tranquil quality of the room fled before him. He looked angry, furious even. Filled with indignant rage, he bellowed, "These savages refuse to leave. They're hindering our plans and setting us back months." "They aren't savages, dear," the woman in the railcar said as she took another sip from her cup. "They've lived here on this land far longer than we. They merely don't want to leave their homes. Perhaps they wouldn't have to if we built the town a little further over to the east or north up a little." "But then what would be the problem, Would they then complain that we take too much water from them? Or perhaps they might change their minds about us and attack us in the night, scalping us and our children," he continued to yell as he paced the room. "No, the best course of action is to force them out once and for all. They're a dirty and simple-minded people. If they can find the ability to live here in the middle of this God-forsaken land, they can live just about anywhere. You just aren't comprehending this. You came from a simple-minded community as well. You are lucky I saved you from it and gave you a better life." I was astonished by what I was hearing from the man. Savages, dirty and simple-minded people, they were anything but. How could someone be so ignorant and close-minded? Surely this man could hear himself and how ridiculous he sounded. And what of her? Wasn't she compassionate, having come from a simpler community herself? All these thoughts surged through my mind as I continued to watch them speak before me. "Well, being so simple-minded, explain to me just what you had in mind to rectify the situation then," she replied haughtily. "I plan on having some of my men go to their village tonight and force them from the land," he said as he poured himself a cup of tea and taking the first sip. "You can't do that. They're a community that relies on one another. If you force them from their homes in the dead of night, where will they go and what will they do? I don't give much a damn, my dear, quite frankly, he replied, taking another sip, pretending to be a gentleman. They have women and children. What would you do if I and our girls were suddenly forced from our homes in the middle of the night? What would we do then? Oh, like that would ever happen, he said, placing his cup on the table in front of him where he sat on the sofa. I imagine if I thought we were, we'd put up one hell of a fight. That's why my men are going fully armed. I thought you said you were going to remove them from the land. Do you plan on killing them as well? She asked, panic rising in her voice. I plan on any and all contingencies. If they leave quietly, then there will be no bloodshed. But if they don't, he trailed off. If they don't, she continued, then we'll just have to wait and see, he said, arising from the couch and leaving the room. I saw her sitting there silent now, a look of horror on her face. Had she heard him correctly? Did he really plan on forcefully removing and killing an entire village of people just so he could build a town? Did he not foresee what his actions could ensue? Was this really the type of man he was? I could hear all these thoughts run through her mind as she sat uncomfortably on the love seat, the fabric of it clenched between her hands as her heartbeat ran wild. After a few moments, you could see her calm a little. A thought had popped into her mind. Once her husband had made up his mind to do something, he never stopped till he got what he wanted. This she knew. Perhaps, though, there was something surely that she could do to prevent what she knew in her heart was about to happen. I saw her get up from her seat then, raise her head and straighten and smooth her dress, and walk with purpose. She only had a short time to prepare for what would happen next, and prepare she would. She walked over to a roll-top desk that sat in the corner of the room and began to pen a letter to her family back in Mexico. What she wrote, I couldn't see, but she wrote with passion and fury, as if she didn't have enough time to get it all down. She placed the letter in an envelope and put a stamp on it, and then almost sprinted out of the room, letter in hand. The woman who was with me then took my hand and led me after her old self out of the railway car. Once we were safely on the ground, we followed her through an encampment filled with tents and crude buildings meant to serve as temporary housing and storage. There were many men there, hundreds even, and only a few women here and there. I suppose they were the wives of some of the men that had been brave enough to venture west far from their old homes and comforts they knew there. We went past a group of women then. They scarcely wore a thing, and these women, I guess, were the men's only source of entertainment in that near desolate place. She walked up to a man who had his back to her. He was wearing a white long-john undershirt, a pair of light brown slacks with suspenders, and a beige cowboy hat. "Jasper," she called out. "Jasper, I need you to run a letter for me. It's urgent." He turned around to face her, and that's when I saw him, the postman. He looked less tired, more unburdened and whole, if that makes any sense. "Mrs. Bennett," he said as he tipped his hat to her. "What letter do you have for me today, then?" "It's a letter to my family in Mexico. It has to get there as soon as possible. Like I said, it's urgent, and I need you to run it out today," she said in response to his question. "No can do, Mrs. Bennett. I can't be doing that. Your husband has got all the men ready to go tonight to remove the Indians from the land, and I'm gonna go with them. No mail will be going out today, I'm afraid." No, but it has to. Surely you can run it to the nearest posting. My husband could do without one man, surely. "I'm afraid not, ma'am. I have my orders, and I can't lose my job. You aren't the one that pays me, after all," he replied. "Well, how soon can you have it out?" she asked then, after a few moments. Best I can do is Friday next week, ma'am.
But that's over a week from now when you make your usual run," she cried as panic crept once again in her voice. "Surely you can take it sooner. Please, I'll pay extra for your troubles, triple your normal rate."
He thought about it then before settling on a decision. I'll take it from you then and have it out by this Friday. Best I can do." She stood there for a moment, contemplating what to do.
"Well, if that's your best, here then,"
she said, handing over the letter. He took it from her and nodded towards her direction as she turned, making her way back to the railway car, and disappointed that she couldn't get the letter to her family sooner. It was then that the scene went black, and we were left standing, the woman and I in the dark, nothing around us. She turned towards me as I asked her, "What was so important about that letter? Why did you want it delivered so badly?"
"Growing up, my grandma was a bruja. She knew every spell and cleansing ritual there was. When I was little, a Catholic mission church settled in the town and they sought to convert the locals. Being one of the better-known and established families, the priest believed that if my father and our family went to the church, the other locals would also. So we paid my father, a side agreement they had, and we went to the church every day for Mass and every Sunday for church. I grew up in the church and its beliefs. My family eventually did convert, but my grandmother also incorporated her beliefs as well. When I heard what my husband planned to do, I wanted to reach out to her for advice and help. I knew she would know what to do. She always did. I also asked her to reach out to the newest priest, Father Michael, and ask him his advice also. I needed that letter to go out as soon as possible, just in case my gut was right and what I thought would happen would come true," she explained.
"So you knew what your husband planned to do and all you did was write a letter?" I asked, growing frustrated and angry with her.
"I did. I had lived with him for long enough to know what kind of man he was, even if I didn't want to believe it, but I was powerless to stop it. I only had enough money saved back for petty things. I couldn't pay off every man in town, nor could I stop my husband once he got on the warpath. He was a force to be reckoned with then, and all I could do was write that letter,"
she responded. "But what would that do? Your grandmother and Father Michael were thousands of miles away, and that letter wouldn't go out for days. What could they have done to stop what happened?"
I knew nothing could stop what was about to happen. That was completely out of my hands, but all I could do was prepare for what was to come from the blowback of my husband's actions. All I knew was that I had to protect my daughters and I at all costs. Never mind him, she stated, a look of absent-minded determination playing about her.
"So, what did you do once the night was over and the bloodshed had occurred?" I asked her, halfway not wanting to know the answer because I suddenly sensed she had done something horrible.
"I did something horrible."
"What did you do? Surely it can't be as bad as what your husband did."
"When everything happened that night, Jasper set out that Friday to deliver the mail. It took several weeks to arrive and several more for a response to come back. Almost a month and a half later, the return letter came. I took it eagerly from Jasper and tore it open once I got back from his tent. Construction had already begun in the town and things were going up quickly. In the envelope there were 2 separate letters, one from Father Michael, the second larger one from my grandmother. I quickly read Father Michael's letter first. It mainly said to pray that God would forgive our sins and make the town prosperous so the Native Americans didn't die in vain. I thought that was preposterous. I didn't want God to forgive our sins. I wanted him to collect payment for them and avenge the deaths of the innocent, not in turn make the town prosperous, she said with a snort. Not finding what I was looking for, I began to read my grandmother's, and finally I found what I was waiting to hear. My grandmother told me of many different spells I could cast over my wicked husband and his men in the town. In the letter, the spells were laid out, word for word, describing what items I would need to complete them. Some were in Spanish, others surprisingly in Latin. I decided to follow each and cast them all, but unfortunately it wasn't easy to get all the things I needed for the spells. We only had so many resources out of the middle of nowhere. For some of the spells I had to make do with what I had and hope for the best. Other, more important spells, I secretly sent out for the things I need. As for the Latin spells, I didn't know Latin, but I practiced them, trying to correctly pronounce them, all in secret and never in their entirety, only in pieces and parts.
Did they work?
Some did and others didn't. I was able to gather all the supplies needed by the time that night occurred,
she said, now facing away from me for a moment.
The night the villagers came into the town, it had been mostly built. My husband and children and I were fast asleep in the hotel. I wasn't prepared for what came next. None of us were. When the chanting of the peoples rang out in the night, I grew afraid. I didn't care what happened to me or my husband, but my girls, my sweet, sweet girls, I couldn't let anything happen to them. So I jumped out of bed when the screams began and ran to their room. I held them close to me as they cried, tears streaming down their cheeks. That was when I knew I had to do something. So I ran to the old roll-top desk where I had hidden the letter from my grandmother in a secret compartment and took it out. There was one spell I could cast, a protection spell over the hotel protecting all within. While the native people cast their spells, so did I.
She said as she now turned back to face me. The spells, did they work?
They did. Perhaps they were stronger than the ones the native people cast, or maybe perhaps it was for the reason I cast them. Either way, we lived to see another dawn.
I saw then a light, almost as if it was at the end of a tunnel shining in the distance. It was a bright, white light, which illuminated the dark around us. As I stood there, I looked back at Rosa, and I asked her one final question. Your daughters, what became of them? Unfortunately, before she could answer the question, the light began to increase with a loud humming. It made it impossible to hear her over it, drowning out whatever words she had to tell me. And with that, I awoke. As I opened my heavy eyes, I could see I was on a bed, an old quilt upon me to keep me warm, and the bright, unfiltered light of a light bulb shone overhead. It was night wherever I was. I could tell from the chirping of crickets and the other night noises that sounded in the distance. I rolled over onto my back, sore and stiff muscles and joints groaning in protest. I slowly remembered where I was as I laid there for a few moments just staring into the space at the ceiling. Once I had gathered my bearings, I sat up and took a look around the now dimly lit room full of shadows, only held at bay with the light of the singular bulb that hung from the ceiling and the lamp that sat on the bedside table beside me. My eyes scanned the room only to settle on the figure sitting next to the bed in the rocking chair, reading the same book as before. What time is it? I barely choked out, due to the dry mouth and throat I had received from hours of no fluids. I believe it's about 9 p.m. on a Wednesday, he replied, never looking up from his book. My eyes grew wide as I began to start from the bed. I know what you're thinking, and yeah, you've been asleep for about a day and a half, but don't worry. I took care of all the nightly duties for you while you were out cold. I settled back down, knowing things had been taken care of in my absence. You take care of a lot of things, don't you? I said with an accusatory tone. He still didn't look up from his book, and turned the page as he answered. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but yeah, I do. You were one of the men that murdered the villagers who lived on this land long ago, I said, realizing a little too late what that implied. He looked up from his book then, a questioning look on his face. How could you possibly? You know what? Never mind. You can't possibly know what happened that night. You weren't there." But I was, or at least I had a dream about it," I said, still upset at him for what he had done. "A dream? Oh, sweetheart, if you saw what happened that night, it won't a dream. What I can't figure out is why, out of all the caretakers, you seem to be the one chosen for a vision. That don't happen often. Who showed you this so-called dream?" he asked me, resting the book on his lap. "I don't have to tell you that. It's none of your business." Then I added, "And don't call me sweetheart." "Keep your secrets then, and I'll keep mine." We stared at each other then for quite a while. The silence in the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. After a few more moments of intense staring, I got up off the bed. If he wasn't going to explain himself and what he did, and I wasn't willing to share what I knew, then there was no reason for me to stay. I looked around for my shoes that he had apparently taken off of me, first under the bed and then towards the door. After not seeing them there, I heard him speak behind me. "Looking for these?" he said, twirling one of the shoes on his finger. "You know, I never saw how women walked on these." I grabbed the shoes huffily out of his hands and put them on as I moved simultaneously towards the door. Once I had them on, I looked back to where Jasper sat, my hand on the doorknob, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Moon, for all your help, but I think I'll be going now." "I imagine you would be," he said as he looked from me to the door, then back at me, implying once again that I had stated the obvious. This just made me even angrier at him once again. I swung the door open swiftly and headed out into the cool, crisp night air. Once outside, I breathed deeply in, the fresh air doing wonders for my clouded and jumbled thoughts. As I walked back to the hotel, I thought of all that I had seen in my visions. It worried me knowing that somehow, after over 200 years, at least one of the men who assisted in the night raid still lived. What exactly was the curse that the Pueblo people put on the town? What spells did Rosa Bennett put on the place as well, and how did the two coincide? I had too many things to sort through, but I made up my mind that night to get to the bottom of whatever had happened to the town and the hotel that resided within it. I got to the hotel in no time at all and entered through the front door. Locking it behind me, I came through the entryway and up to the doll room, turned the dolls to the walls, and went about feeding Jesus. Once I completed all my nightly duties, I found myself wide awake. I sat down behind the desk to think about things, like how I had found myself caught in a haunted, time-jumping, animal-talking hotel in a town where the dead rise and people never age had me reeling. While lost in thought, I became startled at the sudden sound of the telephone ringing. As I turned to grab the phone off the desk and into my lap to answer it, I accidentally pulled the cord too far. That's when I noticed that the phone wasn't even plugged in at all. I looked now back at the rotary phone in my lap, still ringing, and slowly picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, as I awaited a response. I only heard slight crackling and static over the phone. "Hello, who is this?" I asked again, a little louder this time. "This is your conscience speaking," the voice on the other end of the line replied. "Ah, great. What can I do for you, Jiminy Cricket?" I responded sarcastically. I need to speak to you about the hotel. Not everything is what it seems," the phone entity said. "Yeah, I kind of figured that out already," I said, getting annoyed. "So what's your take on the hotel?" "Don't trust the girl in room number 1, the voice hissed. "You mean Deborah? She seems so nice," I said as I looked around the room, trying to see if I was still alone. I didn't want Deb coming in if the phone entity and I were going to be talking about her. Just beware, she may seem nice, but she is the reason for your suffering. Well, thank you for the advice, but unless you can be less cryptic about things, I think I'll go now. It's getting late and I need to get up early in the morning, I said as I began to move the receiver from my ear. On the other side of the line, I heard, "Just listen to me," as I hung up the phone and placed it back on the desk. I sat there a moment longer, contemplating what the phone entity had said. What was so bad about Deb, and why was she the reason for my suffering? The last couple of days were strange, sure, but I was hardly suffering. I got up from the stool behind the desk and headed for my room. Before I went inside, I looked once more at the picture just outside my door. The picture unnerved me for a reason I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the fact that everyone in the picture had been dead or gone for over 200 years. Maybe it was the man who built the town and his arrogant, self-righteous stare. Or maybe it was simply a secret that the picture hadn't divulged yet. Either way, I moved away from the painting quickly and headed inside my room. Once I had shut my door, I changed into my night clothes. A pink pajama set with red hearts that I had bought as a Valentine's Day present to myself a few years back when I didn't have a Valentine. Once done, I removed my makeup and washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. The glue from the stamps and the elixir did a number on me. I had a sickly hue to my skin that made me as pale as a ghost, a look that didn't exactly scream health and vigor. I decided that all I needed was a good night's sleep and a good healthy breakfast in the morning. I climbed into bed, and for the first night since arriving, I slept peacefully and dream-free. In the morning, I woke up feeling refreshed and like I could take on the day. As I dressed, I thought about all that had happened over the last few days and made a silent vow to make most of each day, regardless of what that particular day held. Once I finished, I walked down into the kitchen area past the dining hall, thought of a wonderful full breakfast, and opened the oven to find it waiting for me. I had always loved fresh biscuits. I opened the fridge to find the rest of my meal, a tropical fruit bowl, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. I took my meal out to the dining room table, sat down, and enjoyed it. As I sat there absent-mindedly poking at the mango with my fork and staring out the window out to the alleyway, I saw Deb go through. I quickly got up from my seat and dashed to the window to see where she could possibly be going. To my knowledge, there was nothing but barren land behind the town. Being the nosy person I was, I decided to follow her. By the time I got down to the first floor and out the door, all I saw was the sleeve of her dress as she darted behind the hotel. I walked along as fast as I could without being heard. Maybe it had been the warning from the phone entity from last night, but I was feeling a little suspicious of her. The voice on the phone had told me to beware because she wasn't all that she seemed. I began to wonder if the voice had been right now that I followed her. As I began to wonder about my safety, I heard a slow, singing start. It started out slow and gradually sped up as the volume increased. When I rounded the corner, I was surprised by what I found. There, in the clearing of the wasteland behind the town, was Deb, singing as though in prayer and worship as she danced. What she said I couldn't understand, and who she prayed to I didn't know, but the words flowed through the air with a blissful, melodic sound. As I stood there watching her, I hoped whoever she sang to could hear her, and granted her whatever she wished. All too soon the song ended, and the only sound left to hear was the wind that swept through the land, whistling as it went. She turned then and saw me standing there peeking out from the back corner of the building. I tried to quickly hide myself, but it was in vain. I had been caught. "You don't have to hide. You can come out," she said to me. I came out from around the corner, feeling as if I was a toddler busting for drawing with crayons on the wall. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to spy. I just saw you from the window and came to see what you were doing behind the hotel. I was singing a song to the Sun Mother. The song is called Hymn to the Sun. Did you like it?" I thought it was beautiful. What was the song about? I asked her as I came closer to where she stood.
It's a song where we give thanks to the Sun Mother and all she does for us, and we listen to the sounds of nature as they call out to us," she told me. Then she added, "It's a song of my people, and it's even more beautiful when sung as a group." "Your people? Who are your people?" I asked. "My people lived on this land long ago for hundreds of years, long before there was ever a town here." "But if you are, how can you be, I mean..." I struggled to find the right words that wouldn't offend her. She giggled as she turned to look towards the sun. "You mean, how is it that I'm a native Puebloan if I'm black?" "Well, yeah," I answered honestly. "Many of the first cowboys in the West were people native to the land and people of color. Those who fled slavery for a better life, and later on, after the Civil War, ex-slaves who were in search of a way to make a living. My ancestors descended from both. My mother was Pueblo and my father was black. But it doesn't take away or dilute my ancestry. I'm proud and honored to be descended from both." "That's amazing," I said, now in awe of her. "What brought you to this town? Was it the place where your ancestors lived?" "Yeah, it was. This was once sacred land to my people, but unfortunately, like many native peoples all over the world, others stole their land and sought to colonize it to their benefit and purpose, driving them out. I come here every year in the summer to visit the land of my people and to pay homage to those that were lost to us." I'm so sorry. I know I can't give the land back to your people, but if there's anything I can do to help you or make your stay better, I will certainly try." "Thank you. That means a lot coming from one of the caretakers. You're different. I like that." After we finished our conversation, we parted ways. She went to walk on the outskirts of town, and I headed back to the hotel. The voice that had warned me on the phone had been wrong. She was merely one of the people who belonged to the land, and a kind person at that. What was the voice so sure of that it felt the need to warn me of her? As I re-entered the hotel, I saw sitting on the desk a stack of books, a couple of pill bottles, and a note. The note read, "Glad to see you're up walking around and being nosy. You left these on my place. I hope you can return them on time. Jasper Moon." I quickly opened the first book in the stack, looking at the checkout dates and return times listed on the inside front cover. I began to panic when I saw that they were due that day at noon. I looked at the grandfather clock, which read 11:56 a.m. I scooped up the remaining items I had to finish returning from Mr. Elberton's room and ran out the door. I didn't know what would happen if I was late to return the books, but I didn't want to find out. I nearly tripped over the front steps on my way down them. My mother had always called me Grace in jest, growing up because of my clumsiness. As I sprinted toward the library, I heard a laugh in the distance and someone call out, "Run, girl, run!" Followed by even more obnoxious laughter. Oh, God, how I couldn't stand Jasper. I reached the front door of the library in record time. I was out of breath as I started up the stairs. I needed to work out more, I guess. The library, like the post office, was similar in size and depth. I didn't think there were too many books that could possibly be inside, but I was sure the ones I was carrying would be greatly missed if I didn't hurry. I passed under the metal pole that extended past the building's first few steps and looked up at it as I went. I became aware all too suddenly that even though this town held quite a few buildings, none of them had the town name printed on their signs. Come to think of it, I didn't even know what the town name was. It had never been mentioned in any letter, conversation, or even in the childhood stories I grew up with. It had simply always been nameless. I shrugged off this newest revelation and turned the knob of the door, opening it. The library inside was not what I expected at all. I had expected a mostly barren and desolate place with only a few books and half of those filled with moth-eaten pages. A few overhanging light bulbs like in the post office, and an old man or woman who would shush you if you spoke too loud. What I saw in front of me was nothing of the sort. It was a grand library that looked to be the size of at least 10 buildings wide and twice as many deep. Not at all the size I'd expected given the outside of the building. I backed up out the door and shut it in front of me, and turned to walk down the stairs into the side of the building. Just like I thought I had seen, a small building the size of the post office. I quickly dashed up the stairs once again, taking them two at a time, and went back inside. Once again, I was greeted with the same, larger inside-than-out room. I was shocked at its sheer size and elegance. There were, not one, but two grand staircases that wound around, swirling up towards the second floor, one on each side of the room. There were books upon books upon books inside, books that looked old and new, some in languages I recognized and others I didn't, and some small and thick alike. The woodwork inside was fashioned in similar make as the hotel, alluring and beautiful. I stood there admiring the place when I heard a voice up ahead. "Excuse me, may I help you?" I looked from the second floor that seemed to span ever onward, right ahead of me to see a young woman, about my height, small in stature and dressed in the same period clothes as all the people I had met so far, not including Deb. I walked up the wooden desk in the center of the room where it sat between the staircases. Getting a closer look at the woman who sat at the desk, she looked quite plain. She almost seemed out of place in that library. She had long, dark brown hair and plaited braids that she piled atop her head in a bun, a floral patterned soft yellow dress that came down to the floor, and a facial expression that read, "Try me." All in all, she seemed almost stoic in nature and hardened by some event that had happened sometime in her life. She was pretty, with dark blue eyes the color of the night sky at dusk, and a fair complexion, but plain nonetheless. I approached her with a shy smile and placed my books on the counter space on top of the desk. Hello, my name is Autumn. I work at the hotel next door and I was hoping to return these. A client of ours left them in his room. I hope they aren't late. I came as soon as I was able," I said, still smiling. After a few moments of standing there with no reply, and a beady look from the librarian, my smile dropped. "You're late. They were due at noon today, and it is," as she checked her pocket watch, "12:02 p.m. "Oh, thank goodness they're only 2 minutes late then," I stated as I let out a slight giggle. The librarian continued to stare at me with that same disapproving look as I began to look elsewhere due to the harsh stare. "Late is late. You'll have to pay a fee," she said, finally taking her eyes off of me, looking down to her record book. "Well, I'm sure I can do that. How much is the fee?" "It's not your ordinary fee. We don't take cash here," she told me, never looking up from the book she now started writing in. "Okay, what do you accept as payment then?" I asked her as she looked up from her book. "We accept time as payment. Nothing more, nothing less. 1 hour per late book, and it looks like you have 9. You can begin immediately." "Wait, 9 hours of what?" I asked, thoroughly confused. 9 hours of work," she replied, as if I had just asked the dumbest question possible. "Oh, I can do that, no problem. I always thought about working in a library when I was little." She looked very unimpressed. "You can start by organizing the books in the fiction wing upstairs. Take these and put them in the right place," she said as she handed me an armful of books. "Just take the staircase to your left. You can't miss it." With that, I made my way with the armful of books to the staircase and made the twirling climb. Once on the second floor, I saw what she meant. Right in front of me was a beautifully hand-painted sign that read fiction. I looked at the first book on the top of the stack, entitled Journey Out West, by some author I had never heard of before. Out of curiosity, I opened the book, but was quickly regretful for having done so. In a second, I blacked out and was transported through time and space to the setting the book was in. I was out west, probably somewhere on the plains, and there was a herd of buffalo in front of me, snorting and grunting at my presence. I found myself going along with the story of the book, experiencing the journey of a rugged man who worked for the railroad headed out west towards California. I was chased by a buffalo, shot by a fellow railway worker, and hunted as an outlaw after I stole from the railroad company. I felt everything the main character experienced, and it was terrible. Only when the book ended did I snap back to reality. It felt like an eternity that I had been in the book, but I looked at my watch and only 2 hours had passed. I tried to shake the weird feeling off and continue with my work. The second book had the title printed on the inside cover. In order for me to properly place it, I would feel I have to open it. So I did. The title read 500 Feet Under the Sea, and just like that, I was transported into the tale. It was a story about a marine biologist who would often dive under the sea with dolphins and other aquatic life, surveying the ocean and recording her findings. It was a pleasant book, one that I didn't mind being in. When it was over, I was a little sad to leave. I once again snapped back to reality in a fraction of a second. I moved on to the next book, and the one after that, and the one after that, opening the covers and immersing myself in each story. I felt everything the main characters felt and saw all that they did. And to be so fully immersed in each story was extraordinary and wonderful. Once I finished, there was only about 2 hours left on my clock left to work, so I went back downstairs to the librarian to let her know I finished. There she sat in her chair, reading and writing in the same record book. "I've finished returning all the books you gave me," I said triumphantly. "So you have," she replied in a monotone voice. "Here, one last book for you. This one is nonfiction." The book she handed me was quite old and worn. The cover looked like it held on by a thread, and the pages looked torn and frayed. I opened the book only to realize it wasn't a book at all, but a personal diary. Who the author was, it didn't say, but I had my suspicions. I was transported into this book as well, but it was different than all the others. In this book, I was once again part of the book, but everything was in the first-person narrative of the writer themselves. Everything felt more real, more raw somehow. I felt myself being jostled on a train headed to a land unknown. I experienced firsthand the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of the writer. They wanted a fresh start in the new land, a place to call home and simply be more than they had always been. They wanted so many things, but as the story progressed, things began to look more and more disheartening. In this book, the writer chronicled their day-to-day life as they began their fresh start. The land was everything they had hoped it to be. Everything was perfect, until the native people began to push back. In the daily logs, it was said how the people would come to their camps late at night and steal everything that they could if it was left out. The people began to guard their territory and become menacing, causing great fear for the writer. Everything came to a head the night the townspeople left their camps to drive out the native people. The writer knew it was wrong, but desperately wanted a new life so much that they turned a blind eye to what had been done. They knew in their hearts that some sort of retribution would take place, but had no idea when. The story then went on to show me the happenings of that night, when everything changed. A fire engulfed much of the town, and people were heard screaming in the distance. The writer knew there was nothing they could do but write, so write they did, cataloging moment by moment the events that unfolded. The chanting and singing grew loud in the night, and the screams rang out, and they seldom stopped unless by force. The room the writer was in was somewhere in the town, and heat filled it, pouring in from the streets. The door broke open and a dark figure loomed in the doorway, threatening and large. It held a bow in one hand and an arrow in the other. As the figure pulled back on the bow with the arrow pointing at the writer, I felt their fear and heard them scream. Then, before the arrow could loose from its bow, a man then came to the rescue, striking the figure down with one heavy blow. Gunshots began to ring out in the night, and the chanting ceased, fleeing for the hills outside the town. The damage the people had come to do had been done. As the writer stayed huddled up in the corner, the man who had rescued then came closer and took their hand, leading them out of the hot home and into the street. In the light of the fires, I could see for the first time who the writer's savior had been. It was Jasper Moon. I was shocked by this, but before I could find out what happened for the rest of the night, the book ended all too soon. I snapped back, disappointed that I didn't get to find out what happened to the town after that. As I stood there, the librarian never looked up at me from her work. All she did was point me in the right direction to the nonfiction section. I placed the book on the shelf, not knowing what to think of the experience. I noticed that there were several more diaries on the shelf and resolved to read them one day. I looked at my watch, as the timer went off, signaling the end of my time here at the library. I silently walked out of the library, being sure not to bother the librarian on the way out. As I headed back to the hotel, I thought of all I had just experienced. The hope, those hopes being dashed, the fear, and the relief at the end of the night. As I entered the hotel, I felt tired, as if I had run a marathon. That's when I heard the phone ring once again. Hello? I said as I answered it.
Oh, I tried to warn you.
Ah, if it isn't Jiminy Cricket, what can I do for you this time?
Oh, I tried to warn you about Deborah. She will curse you, and...
But before the voice could even finish, I butted in. Listen here, Deb is a nice person. She hasn't cursed me. And not that it is any of your cricket business, but I don't trust you or your judgment. Unless you identify yourself, I don't much care what you have to say, I said with anger rising in my voice. Right then I heard the line click. Then a thump sounded from upstairs. Thinking it couldn't be a coincidence, I rushed upstairs to where a now scraping sound seemed to originate. Room number 9. I unlocked the door and thrust it open. What I saw on the other side, I wasn't prepared for.